This is the IFES podcast. I'm Laura Osio. In an ideal world, every election would be above reproach. In reality, however, no vote can be completely free of all fraud, and we must keep a constant watch for anything that would prevent the results of an election from reflecting the will of the people. In this first of a series of podcasts on election fraud, Rafael Lopez-Pintor, IFES election specialist, defines election fraud and tells us whether it can be prosecuted in international courts. He speaks to us from Spain. Rafael, what is electoral fraud?
Well, electoral fraud belongs to the family of political corruption, although corruption is a wider concept, covers a wide range of malpractices than just electoral fraud. Fraud specifically refers to deceptive or negligent interference with the electoral process, electoral materials, and election-related materials that prevents the result of the elections from reflecting the will of the people. So, fraud is any purposeful action in tampering with election-related materials which ends up affecting the results in a way that, had that action not been perpetrated, the result of the election would have been different. There is could be differentiated essential fraud and non-essential fraud. That's important because essential fraud is, as I said before, when it affects the result of the election in terms of who wins and who loses. Non-essential fraud is fraud in terms that there is tampering with the ballot, but it's not affecting the result of the election. It ends up only in criminal, punishment or civil consequences, etc.
I have heard you say many times that electoral fraud is more than just a matter of civil or criminal law. Why is this?
This is because electoral fraud implies the violation of a basic right, which is the right to elect and to be elected to public office. It affects the genuine expression of the will of the people. Of course, electoral fraud may have consequences stemming from civil or criminal law, but it goes farther than that, since it may affect the composition of the government of a country, with all that is entailed in terms of policy options, styles of government, and even the protections of freedoms and rights affecting the nation. This is why we should keep this difference in mind, that this malpractice goes far beyond, civil and criminal consequences that the fraudulent action may have.
As you've pointed out, electoral fraud infringes on political rights that are guaranteed by international public law documents. For example, the 1966 UN Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Does this mean that electoral fraud can be prosecuted in international courts?
Well, I would say yes in principle. Then in practice, this is a most difficult action to be undertaken, mainly because proof of some practices of essential fraud would be extremely difficult to be brought to a court, mainly regarding disenfranchisement or computer tampering, which is the way fraud takes place more often, in current times. Another difficulty stems from that a methodology to properly gogging and assessing fraud still remains to be developed. Moreover, the fact fraud of some extent is likely to take place in any of the many countries where the freedoms and rights are not fully protected. If you look at the 2010 Freedom House report, it shows that only, although this is a lot, 46% of countries can be considered free and 54% only partly free or not free. And so in these countries where the freedoms and rights are not properly protected is when fraud is more likely to occur. This means, in fact, that prosecuting fraud at the court, that really, as I said, in practical terms, it is very, very difficult. Still, we should not forget that sometimes punishment of massive fraud has taken place recently by toppling governments after popular revolt when massive fraud has been discovered. Let's think of Peru with Fujimori in 2001, Serbia under Milosevic, and more recently the case of Ukraine. There were popular revolt because fraud was so clear, so clearly perpetrated that the people just, overthrew the government. So, again, I would say that in principle,
Any additional thoughts? Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I would add that traditionally, the places of fraud were the polling stations and the surrounding of the polling stations. So it was tampering with ballot papers and voter lists, and also the counting of the ballot and the writing of the tallies at the polling station. This is not any longer the case. I mean, this happens there, but the more frequent places of fraud these days are much more difficult to detect. Not the places, but the fraudulent action where fraud is perpetrated is more difficult. It is basically when you are enfranchising the people, particularly the more vulnerable populations like ethnic minorities, women, youth, peasants. So many of these people are enfranchised, and this happens long before elections day. So usually very few people are aware of this, and even less are monitoring this. And then that fraud is hard to measure, it's hard to assess. And then at the other end of the process, which is the centralized counting and computer centers, modern technology makes it easier to make fraud where no vigilant eyes are observing, which is at the time of counting in the computer center. So then these countries I mentioned before, always this is where fraud, the big thing, happens at the computer center. But then it was so apparent because most people had voted a different thing than what the results were reflecting. But this is important to be taken in mind because a methodology to be developed should include these new elements, that modern technology on the one hand, and the disenfranchisement of so many segments of population, vulnerable population in so many countries, takes place, and it passes inadvertently.